Hello and welcome back to Music Appreciation. This is Dr. Jordan again, and today I'm going to be narrating some aspects of Viennese classical period music. In your textbook, this begins with chapter 11 in your textbook, and it takes you through basically the music of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and because these are the three really gigantic, towering figures of this period, which begins roughly 1750 and ends around 1825 or so. And it's basically three generations of composers, Haydn being the oldest, Mozart in the middle, and Beethoven in the last generation. So we're going to talk about some aspects of European history in the Western Europe that drive these composers to do what they did. Um, so this is often called the Enlightenment. Um, and the Enlightenment really is a scientific revolution that helps people see the universe in a very different way. And it involves mainly this trust in science to describe the universe and help us to understand it. Uh, and the music is kind of influenced by that in a lot of ways. So we're going to talk about some of the influences on composers here, culturally and historically, and then discuss what they're doing musically. This era is pretty much one of the most opulent uh, eras in all of Western European history. And that opulence is captured pretty well by the French painter Fragonard and Watteau in England. There you see two paintings, and you see with the Watteau on the left, you see the opulence portrayed. This woman in the center is on a swing, surrounded by a leafy sort of grove, and her friend there is lying there talking to her. These are the. I mean, it's Fragonard relied on a lot of pastel colors, and those pastels and the shadings that he used just emphasize the elegance and the the opulence of uh, life in French for a tiny minority of French people. If you were an aristocrat in France before 1789, you had life was good. Okay, um, they had plenty to eat. They had a lot of fun. They told jokes. They lived it up. But for the rest of the 98% of French people, it wasn't so great. So, and this leads to the downfall here of this whole French aristocracy in 1789 with the advent of the French Revolution. Over in England, it wasn't quite as, England really gave birth to this industrial revolution. And that certainly has an effect on music and art as well. These two revolutions, the political, social one in France and the industrial revolution in England, really helped shape the modern world and also has a tremendous effect on music and composers in general. So there you see Watteau and Fragonard. And the Watteau painting isn't quite as elegant as you see as the Fragonard example. Sometimes there is this moral kind of emphasis here, and you see that with the Rake's Progress. Uh, the Rake's Progress isn't about progress; it's about a guy who is. It's like the prodigal son story in the Gospel of Luke. Okay, he wastes his life in riotous living and ends up in an insane asylum. And so here you have the gaming table here, with some notations underneath as to what's going on. The rake is basically losing all his money. And notice how these people are a bit less respectable, if you will. Um, these are, um, so the Hogarth series of 8 paintings is really a kind of a exploration about how not to live. Um, and the poor rake ends up in Bedlam, the infamous insane asylum in London. So there is this kind of didactic moral emphasis sometimes in this culture. We see that with Don Giovanni. Um, there's a connection here with Mozart's Don Giovanni, right? The world's greatest lover who is judged finally at the end of the opera when the stone guest comes to dinner and condemns him, and he goes straight to hell. So you have that emphasis too in Mozart's operas. Opera is there are efforts to reform opera, and so a lot of the conventions are challenged here. So the Handelian opera, where we have recitative aria, and there has to be a long prelude and a long postlude. You heard that with the Every Valley, because there's this ritornello at the beginning, and then the ritornello comes back at the end. So you have a prelude and a postlude, and people like Christoph von Gluck challenged that idea, as did the War of the Buffoons, and certainly in England, the Beggar's Opera that bankrupted Handel. Um, these, the Beggar's Opera is really a parody of an Italian Handelian opera. So these things challenge um, the conventions of Baroque opera, and so we see kind of a new, more creative operatic style emerging after this. And we'll talk about that when we get to Mozart, who really started where Gluck left off in terms of understanding just how important drama was to the opera and how this music could be used to make the drama of the opera more interesting. So again, here we have sort of a comparison of these Baroque and classical styles. The symmetrical melody rather than a continuous melody. So that after 1750, we get more symmetry in terms of the melody. So if we're going to listen to Eine kleine Nachtmusik, you're going to hear bum, 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 bum. So that goes up, right? Bum, 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 bum. Then it comes back down, bum, 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 bum. So you have this symmetrical melody. We're going up for 2 bars, then we come down for 2 bars. And rather than a single rhythm, we have a multiple dance rhythms that are used. Less chromaticism, and again, the Mozart Eine kleine Nachtmusik, bum 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 bum. That's C major. Then we're going to have a G7, bum 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 bum. So you have a tonic chord and a dominant chord. Um, and usually, the to harmonize an entire uh, piece, Mozart didn't really require anything but tonic, subdominant, and dominant. Those are just 3 chords. And he changed keys frequently, but then he still just uses those 3 chords, and so you don't hear the diminished 7th chord quite as much as you did with Bach and others before. A very homophonic texture. These symmetrical melodies that are so singable and so likable will often just be homophonic in nature. So you've got the melody, and then everything else is an accompaniment. So yeah, they don't, in the Baroque period, and we talked about the fugue, remember, which was polyphonic, and certainly the tenor chorale from the cantata, cantata number 140 that we discussed is it's much more There's much more polyphonic texture in that, where the tenors are singing the melody and the ritornello in the orchestra is playing along underneath it. And so you have those two melodies going on at the same time. There are new forms. Haydn invents the string quartet, which is a form of chamber music, and the symphony, which is a sonata for orchestra. So you don't, and the concerto keeps going. Uh, but the concerto grosso is not as important. Um, so you don't see concerto grosso being used as a term in this period after 1750, but you certainly hear a lot of solo concertos, so you get that. The piano emerges as well as an instrument in its own right. Baroque composers didn't write a lot for piano, but with the the addition of this damper pedal, where the piano could sustain notes more effectively, then we get um, the piano being used more and more often. So Haydn and Mozart and certainly Beethoven wrote piano concertos and piano sonatas to be played on the piano. So the piano in this period isn't the same as our big old Steinways that we have. Um, so don't get the idea that it's the same piano that we have today. But nevertheless, the same basic technology of the hammer hitting the string is employed. So we also have new forms, sonata allegro, theme and variations. So this is, and we're going to talk about these forms as we go through: rondo, theme and variations, sonata allegro, scherzo and trio, and minuet and trio. So these forms are employed by these composers after 1750. The old ritornello form that in the concerto kind of dies out, and it's replaced by sonata allegro in various forms of it. So yeah, um, and we still have ternary and binary form in the Baroque that's still used in the Viennese classical period. Emotional balance over just one emotion is important. So rather than concentrating on one emotion, they concentrate on a balanced series of emotional effects as you go through the music, and there's also always a dignified sense of reserve. Um, it's very reserved music until we get to Beethoven, and he throws that out. But and there are good reasons for that, and we'll talk about them. But so we have this sense of emotional balance and a sense of elegance. Uh, and when you hear the Mozart piano concerto in A, there's a kind of an elegance about that theme. Dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-da-dum. And so you get that wonderful sort of sense of emotional reserve. Yeah, as I said before, we have these new forms: sonata allegro, rondo, theme and variations. We're going to take you through all of those, and they all outlined very well in the textbook. So pay attention to the listening guides as you listen to these musical examples. One of the most important aspects of this music in the Viennese classical period, and this continues right on to the present day, is this idea of development of musical ideas. So the symphony number 40 in G minor. It starts out with this falling half step. And so you get this falling half step. And so and that forms the sort of the kernel for the entire first movement of that symphony number 40. And it comes back in various ways. So it's in the exposition, it's stated in the key of G minor, and you hear it. Then you'll hear a second theme as well. Then what we get is a development of this idea. So So you'll hear it stated as a falling half step. Then he turns it upside down and turns it into a rising half step. Ba-da-dee, 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 ba-da-dee. And so it goes up instead of down. And so this whole thing in the development comes back in the Symphony Number 5 in C minor by Beethoven. We have that famous da 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 dee, da 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 dee, that famous four-note idea, which really is keeps coming back during the entire rest of the symphony. There's four movements in the symphony, and that that idea, that four-note motive, keeps coming back in different ways. So in the second movement, we hear bum ba dum bum 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 ba 1 2 3 4, and so we have that. Then in the fourth movement, we get this four-note idea: buddly-dee, 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 biddly-dee, biddly-dee, buddly-dee. Four-note idea: 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4. And so you hear that four-note idea coming back. It's transformed too over the course of the symphony. So thematic development is a major part, and with the theme and variations, you'll hear the Haydn Symphony Number 95. Bum 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 bum, and that's turned into that's one of the variations. Then again, you hear it in bum 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 bum. You hear it in minor key as well, and so each variation involves some sort of development of that basic little simple theme that Haydn begins with. So development of musical ideas is a very important part of this music in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And so we certainly had multi-movement concertos and sonatas in the Baroque period, and so we see the sonata cycle there, and it's further developed and explored in the late 18th and early 19th centuries by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Um, so most of this music is absolute music. It doesn't tell a story. So the instrumental music of this period doesn't tell a story. Now, obviously, we have opera and we have oratorio, and uh, and those things. That's where the stories get told, but not in most of the instrumental music. So the now that doesn't mean there aren't autobiographical elements in these things. Mozart and Haydn steer clear of that because they still are part of this patronage system. But with Beethoven, that system breaks down because of the Napoleonic era and the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon and all of this stuff. That patronage system begins to break down. So Beethoven is free to make more personal kinds of statements. And so when he in the Fifth Symphony, that da 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 da, that's a defiant statement. Beethoven is not a happy camper here, and he's reflecting the emotional chaos that he feels with this four-note motive. It's he called it fate knocking at the door at some point. So um, yeah. So, but by and large, uh, it is whatever you think it is. Okay, so even though it's Beethoven wrote it to express what he's going through emotionally, it's still kind of absolute music. So it doesn't tell a story. Now, in the 19th century, everybody has to tell a story in the instrumental music. So don't this absolute music period doesn't last that long. But nevertheless, certainly the Symphony Number 40 and the Piano Concerto in A and the Symphony Number 94. Um, this music is charming, elegant, reserved, beautiful, and it doesn't tell a story at all. Of course, we got in the Baroque period, we got La Primavera, uh, right? Music that tells the story of spring. We're not going to get that so much during this period after 1750. So um, here's the sonata cycle for a string quartet or a symphony. Uh, these these pieces will have a 4-note plan. Um, so this sonata cycle is kind of an outline for a composer to follow. And they don't have to follow it exactly as prescribed. They can do different things. In fact, they often do things that will surprise the listener. It's a game they play with the listener. And who is the listener? Well, Count Esterhazy, Joseph II, some guy who's an aristocrat who has lots of money who commissions these works, and the composer says, "Yes, sir," and he writes this music. So, uh, and yes, it's usually a he. Okay. Um, so yeah, we get the first movement of, say, a symphony or a string quartet is usually going to be in sonata allegro form, and this form really came out of the binary form that was employed by composers like Scarlatti in the Baroque period. But it developed into this idea of the exposition, development, recapitulation. So, exposition, you usually have 2 or 3 musical ideas, and these are just melodies. And there is a period, a kind of, you'll start with the first melody, which is in the key that's, and of course, if the Mozart Symphony Number 40 in G minor, it's going to start out in G minor. And so you're going to have this theme in G minor. We would just label it theme 1. Then there's a transitional period that you'll hear. This is all outlined in your textbook, so pay attention as you listen. And then there's a second theme in a contrasting key. Like the Symphony Number 40, the second theme is going to be in B flat major. He changes key there, and we get this second idea in a contrasting key. Very often the exposition is repeated so that you can hear, you can know what's going on before the composer begins this development section. So in the middle of this movement, you have a development section where the composer plays with the thematic ideas. Sometimes he states them upside down. Sometimes he'll truncate them, like in the C minor symphony of number 5 of Beethoven, where he divides the 4-note idea into half and then half again. And it ends up being 1 note just being repeated. So he keeps dividing it up. And Mozart states that falling half step backwards, and you get the instead of coming down, you go up. Sometimes he'll have a section in a major key and a minor key, but the development ends in a major, huge cadence into the original key. So if it's in G minor, there'll be this monstrous cadence with maybe a D7 resolving to G minor for the beginning of the recapitulation. And the recapitulation means just we're going to state these themes again, but we're not going to change key. Okay. So the recapitulation doesn't change key as a rule. So in the G minor symphony, Mozart has the first theme, transition, second theme in G minor, just like the first theme. So, instead of modulating to B flat major. Okay. So that's how the recapitulation works. And very often there is a coda at the end. Coda means tail in Italian. And it's just a little sort of a few bars tacked on at the end of the movement to kind of bring it to a more satisfying conclusion. So those are the elements of Sonata Allegro. When we get to Beethoven, Beethoven loves the coda. Sometimes the coda is longer than the rest of the entire movement combined. um, so Beethoven expands the coda. Why? I don't know. That's just Beethoven. So there you have that. Now, second movement, of course, sonata, the first movement is fast, right? Sonata allegro, it says, so it means it's about 120, 130 beats per minute, probably. Then we get a slow movement that is a lot of times theme and variations. And you can vary the theme, the idea. You can do it rhythmically instead of duple meter. You do it in triple meter, or maybe compound meter instead of 2/4. You go into 6/8. You can basically change the harmonies underneath, uh, so you don't really recognize what's going on. And the melodies, you can basically state the melody in 16th notes instead of eighth notes, that kind of thing. So there, and you'll hear that with the Haydn example from the Symphony Number 94 as we go on. Third movement, in Haydn symphonies and string quartets, and also Mozart, you get a third movement that is minuet and trio. It's in triple meter, it's fairly brisk, and it's a dance form. It's and we heard an example of that with Handel and his minuet and trio back in the Baroque period. And so the minuet and trio continues. It's in ternary form, you know, usually, and so we get that sort of ternary idea. Beethoven uses something called a scherzo in trio. A scherzo means joke. Okay, so you do unexpected things. You do things that vary the rhythm, so no one knows what's going on rhythmically, and you're trying to find the beat, and it's not there. So it's a game you play in the Fifth Symphony Scherzo and Trio. Beethoven starts a fugue, and it sounds like the fugue is getting underway, and then it just stops. And he keeps trying to start it, and it keeps stopping. Finally, there's this stuttering going on. And we look, and then it stops. So it doesn't. The fugue never gets underway, and finally gives up on it and goes back to the scherzo theme. So yeah. So it's kind of that kind of thing. And uh, then in the scherzo and trio leads us into the last movement, the fourth symphony, which is going to be fast again, and it's going to be either sonata form or rondo form. And with rondo form here, you see the plan of these rondo ideas, where you have an A theme and a B theme, and they alternate. Sometimes you add a C theme, so you have three themes in contrasting keys and modes. A lot of times the C theme, if the A theme's major, the C theme will be minor and vice versa. And then the longer rondo is ABA, CABA. It's kind of a circle. You're going around in a circle here. So that's a little different from the sonata form where you have a development. Sometimes you'll throw in some developmental ideas and you'll have something called a sonata rondo form. So that last movement that we're going to hear in the Haydn string quartet, the Bird, is a kind of sonata and rondo kind of combined. So it's a kind of a rondo theme, but then again, some of those ideas are development ideas of the original theme. So it's kind of half sonata, half rondo, which is very charming for listeners. So there you see the whole thing. Sonata Allegro, theme and variations, minuet and trio, sonata Allegro or rondo. Fast, slow, dance-like, fast again, and very sometimes the fourth movement a lot of times is in a fast triple meter, whereas the first movement is in duple meter, but that's not always the case. So, but that's the plan. So it's like when you write a paper, you make an outline. Well, here's what they've made an outline here, and the outline they follow with some sorts of little fun things thrown in. And guess what? The listeners were every bit as sophisticated as the composers, and so they could hear these things going on for the most part. Um, and so they often took music lessons from the composers, so they kind of have an intimate kind of idea of what the composer is doing. And with Haydn's string quartets and symphonies, the patrons often named these things, so they have nicknames: the clock, the bear. I think the bear was the nickname given to one of Haydn's symphonies by Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. We'll hear more about her later on. So yeah, and Maria Theresa gave nicknames to Haydn symphonies and string quartets. The Esterhazy family often did. So the Bird is a nickname probably attached to it by the Esterházys, who were kind of the number two family in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburgs were number one, and the Esterházys were number two. So these are very wealthy aristocratic patrons for whom these pieces were written. So the patronage system is the system that these composers operate under to a great extent until the French Revolution interrupts it all. And the patronage system begins to decline after 1789. It's still around, but it's not as important as it was during, up until 1789. So this is really the height of this idea of a patron-client relationship. Composers and musicians are always the clients here, and the aristocrats, the wealthy people, are the patrons, and they commission the works. The composer says, "Aye, aye, sir." He writes it, and it's presented, and then it's most of the time it's forgotten. Of course, with publishing, you get very often Haydn and Mozart works are published and they're distributed, and people play them all over the world. Haydn string quartets are in Jefferson's library at Monticello. Jefferson was quite a good violinist, and he played Haydn string quartets and appreciated them. Very often during the Revolutionary War, he'd invite Hessians, the German prisoners of war who were taken prisoner at Trenton and in other places, and he would invite them up to the main house to play string quartets. His plantation was a POW camp. So yeah, you have that kind of interaction going on. There you see the Schönbrunn Palace. It's still there today. Everyone is, Versailles is this place that was built about a century before this by Louis XIV, and it was such a good idea. It was so popular that rulers all over Europe began to emulate it. So we get Schönbrunn, and this is the Habsburg Palace in Vienna. We get St. Petersburg. We get several palaces by the czars. Catherine the Great built these things, and they're pretty impressive. We get in Potsdam in Germany, we get the Hohenzollern palaces, and it goes on and on like that. Everybody's got to have a palace that imitates Versailles. And as you can see, lots of tax money is levied in order to build these magnificent palatial structures. And this is where, to a great extent, this music was performed. So it all comes to a screeching halt with the French Revolution, though. Even in Vienna and St. Petersburg, there's no more money to support this kind of architecture. So yeah, you don't see it as much. But you do see it in a strange way in the United States. So there you see the storming of the Bastille with the advent of the French Revolution in 1789. The Bastille Palace was completely torn apart. And people all over France still have bricks from the Bastille. It was a political prison. The French people stormed the prison. They released the political prisoners and tore the thing apart. And that began the French Revolution. In doing this, they wanted to have a revolution just like the American Revolution. It didn't turn out that way, simply because the institutions that, on the ground in France were not as strong or well developed as the institutions in the fledgling United States. There's another shot of the storming of the Bastille. And with this French Revolution, a lot began to change. And we'll see those changes when we talk about 19th century Romanticism in the next segment of the course. I think the Industrial Revolution was even more far-reaching than the French political revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in England with textiles. There you see the cotton gin. And the cotton gin in America contributed to the English Industrial Revolution simply because cotton that was produced, harvested in the American South, a lot of that cotton made its way to England to feed these textile mills. And also in New England, there were textile mills that were set up. So the Industrial Revolution is much more far-reaching than the French political revolution in a lot of ways. It creates our modern capitalist system that has been set up and running um, everywhere in the world since the late 18th century. And so this whole idea of working in a manufacturing environment uh, and the labor practices of the factory owners and bosses, all of this is set up here. And really it diminishes the power of the aristocracies um, because we have a new elite that comes into being, and it's been growing ever since the Middle Ages. But now these people become fabulously rich. The factory owners, uh, these guys um, who own these businesses, bankers, factory owners, merchants, they become fabulously rich, and they're able to basically make a statement politically that, and so they're kind of a they rival the power of the aristocrats, and um, they create a kind of an aristocracy of their own as a result of the industrial revolution. So this is a very important development, and it kind of works to democratize societies in Western Europe to an extent. Um, it's really the formation of a new elite to replace the old elites. And we have a revolution in the intellectual climate. People like Voltaire began challenging some of the beliefs of the church. We see the rise of deism. Voltaire was a deist. Jefferson was certainly a deist. John Adams was influenced by deism. So was Benjamin Franklin. And so we see an increasing challenge among the intelligentsia, if you will, to some of the ideas espoused by Christianity. Um, and they trusted science to make the world a better place. And so the scientific method comes to the fore, and we see the growth of technologies. The steam engine is a good example. The steam engine really leads to the automation of factories. It leads to the railroad. It leads to steam-powered ships that go along rivers and then eventually become ocean-going vessels. So we get this new intellectual climate. It's called the Enlightenment, and in Western Europe in particular, it was hostile to the church and to the aristocracy. Voltaire famously said that we'll only be free when the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. And that anti-clerical sentiment is reflected in the French Revolution. It's different in the American Revolution, where people just say, "Look, you're free to believe whatever you want to believe. Government isn't going to interfere with your religion." So we have religious freedom in the United States, uh, but that didn't happen in the French Revolution. They're openly hostile in many cases to the church. There's another shot of Voltaire, um, the leader of the Enlightenment. There are many others, including Jefferson. Um, Taxonomy, classifying everything, organizing your thinking, dictionaries, encyclopedias. All of those things come out of the Enlightenment. Um, so And the music reflects that, right? It's organized, it's balanced. Architecture reflects that. Look at the Capitol building. Right? We've got the Senate on one side, the House on the other side, and the dome in the middle. It's balanced. It's symmetrical. The art is symmetrical. Look at that Fragonard painting that I showed you. Even this painting of Voltaire is symmetrical, isn't it? So there's this symmetry, this triangular thing going on, and that's reflective of the balance in this period. Jefferson spoke of something that he called natural religion, and by that he meant and he talked about a God of nature. He said, if we can understand nature, we can understand God, and because God operates through nature. And for Jefferson, right, Jefferson was a fan of Newton. The universe ran according to well-defined laws, and those laws were absolute. You couldn't break the laws. They're there, those laws of nature. So God must be a God of nature. So there's no uh, there's no God does not intervene. There's no transcendence in Jeffersonian religion. Um, and so God doesn't intervene. So there can't be a virgin birth or a resurrection or any of that sort of thing. Jefferson rejected all that. In fact, he got tired of reading all that stuff in the Bible, so he basically took a razor blade and cut out the sections of the New Testament that he liked and left all the rest. And so he only read the parts he liked. The Sermon on the Mount. He liked the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't find it the least bit challenging to the fact that he owned 200 slaves. I don't know why, but he sort of compartmentalized that part. That's the rotunda at the University of Virginia, designed by Jefferson. Jefferson actually uh, began this University of Virginia and designed these buildings. And if this looks like the Parthenon in Rome, it's not accidental. it's That's exactly what he wanted it to look like. It's a very balanced, symmetrical structure with that wonderful triangular portico with the columns, very Greco-Roman in its design. If you go to Monticello, you'll see the same sort of symmetrical design for Monticello. And so it's very much designed on classical ideals. So this is the height of this influence of Greco-Roman classicism in art and in architecture and in music. That that emphasis begins to break down um, towards the end of this period, though. And it begins to break down with Goethe, Schiller, Rousseau, these people, and begin to challenge this Greco-Roman classicism. And we'll hear from Goethe with the Erlkönig, the Earl King, later when we introduce the 19th century Romanticism. But these people begin to challenge those sorts of ideas. Um, there's another shot of Goethe. We've talked about classicism and music here in the Viennese school, um, and you're going to be hearing, more lyrical melodies, singable melodies, diatonic harmonies, regularity rhythmically, and even some folk kinds of elements, especially in final movements of Haydn's symphonies and string quartets. There's Count Esterhazy, Haydn's patron. Haydn worked for the Esterhazys, I think, for 40 years. And it was a very good working relationship. Haydn really adapted well to the patronage system. Uh, the Habsburgs in Vienna were musical patrons, and Mozart, to further his career as a composer, Mozart left Salzburg and went to Vienna, where he received numerous commissions from aristocrats, um, and they're always temporary. Mozart was more freelance than Haydn was, but he was able to supply the aristocrats with an acceptable number of compositions. Now, there's kind of a myth that Mozart, because he died broke, he never made any money. Um, that isn't really true. Mozart made quite a bit of money. He just wasn't very good at managing it. So yeah, the reason he died broke was because he spent it all lavishly and with this confidence that he could always make more because he knew that he was a fabulous composer, and well, he was. So yeah, so we get that emphasis here with Mozart. Beethoven, on the other hand, freed himself from that position by playing the Habsburgs against the Bonapartes, and we'll talk about that when we get to Beethoven. It's kind of a Beethoven kind of was a genius in that way. He said, "Okay, I'll either work for you or for the Bonapartes. Which do you prefer?" And the Habsburgs said, "You're working for us, Joe." And and so he he he, uh, he used that to get a pension for life from the Habsburgs. Brilliant. And again, the Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which you hear all the time, is a serenade. So these divertimento, serenade, these are uh, uh, chamber music forms that were popular in Vienna during this period. But the most popular of them all was the one that Haydn invented, the string quartet. People are still composing string quartets, believe it or not. And it's because it's a perfect little ensemble of four players, two violinists, a viola, and a cello. And so string quartets are a big part of classical music repertoire um, since about 1750 when Haydn started doing it for the Esterházys. And Mozart composed them, Beethoven composed them. Then in the 19th century, Schubert composed them, Brahms composed them. In the 20th century, Shostakovich composed them, and people are still composing them today. Let me mention chamber music. Chamber music is just a more intimate kind of music designed for a smaller venue with a small group of players. So the symphony is for a concert hall or a large venue, whereas chamber music is for a small venue. Okay, Mozart. Um, yeah, one of the greatest geniuses who ever lived. Doesn't matter what area of genius you were in. Mozart is up there with Einstein and Newton and all the guy who invented the wheel, whoever that was. Uh, that's where he is. He is absolutely one of the most brilliant people who ever lived. He was born in Salzburg in Austria, and his sister Nannerl taught him music from the time he was maybe 18 months old. So and he exhibited a great genius, and Nannerl encouraged that. And of course, Mozart's father was also a musician, and he encouraged Mozart as well. Uh, Leopold was played for the Archbishop of Salzburg, who is the guy who ran the town. Uh, so it's a company town. It's run by the Archbishop, and so Leopold was the concert master, the Kapellmeister for the Archbishop, and he wrote music to serve the Archbishop's needs. And so Mozart grew up in this musical family. When Mozart was 8 years old, they went to London because Leopold wanted to use his kids, Nannerl and Wolfgang, to make money. The family wasn't that wealthy, and why not, have the kids give concerts to make money? And so they went to London. They thought they were going to make a killing, and London turned out not to be so great. Then, so they were struggling in London to get by, and Leopold got sick, so he couldn't arrange concerts. Consequently, the 8-year-old Mozart wrote a symphony, his first symphony, four-movement symphony, wonderful piece in the key of A minor. And Mozart never looked back after that. He was off to the races composing. The family had to leave London and go back to Salzburg, and Mozart continued to tour Europe, giving concerts, playing music, um, and so and he met all the crowned heads, the emperor of the Empress Maria Theresa, King Louis the 15th, and the Dauphin, the future Louis the 16th of France, the Pope. As a young guy, he basically he met everybody in Europe because he played concerts for them, and he toured extensively. And he wrote music, wrote piece after piece after piece of music. Um, he married Constanze Weber uh, as a young man. He was literally kicked out of Salzburg by the seat of his pants, run off by the archbishop because he wouldn't cooperate with what the archbishop wanted. So the archbishop threw him out. Um, and he went to Vienna, where he met and married Constanze Weber, uh, had some children, and freely composed these things. So by the 1780s, Mozart is doing very well as a composer, writing symphonies, piano concertos, operas. He and Lorenzo da Ponte collaborated on these three great comic operas, right? Marriage of Figaro, Così fan tutte, and Don Giovanni. And these are beloved operas that are done. He ran into trouble financially towards the end. Um, he composed the Magic Flute, um, which is a little bit of a different kind of opera from the comic operas that he composed with Da Ponte. It's a Singspiel, like a Broadway show, really. And the Magic Flute, just as it took off, Mozart died. Um, he died of probably typhus, something like that, a waterborne illness. Cholera and typhus were common in the 18th century. They had no idea the germs caused disease. And so, because there's no money to bury him, he was literally buried in a pauper's grave, along with it was a site where they basically buried the poor and homeless. And we're still not quite sure where he's buried today. But yeah, he gave us music of all kinds: piano sonatas, chamber music, string quartets, divertimentos, serenades, symphonies, right? Dozens of them. And these operas, there are three kinds of operas in Vienna: the comic opera, the serious opera, and the Singspiel. The comic opera and serious opera were performed in Italian. The Singspiel is in German. And Mozart was a genius at composing all of them. He wrote his first piano concerto, I think, when he was 14. Wrote his first symphony when he was 8. Wrote an opera when he was 12. Okay, and he just kept writing. He so he wrote some almost 700 pieces of music by the time he died at age 35 or 36. So and the music is still beloved today. We hear it all over the place, everywhere. The idea of a symphony really began with a guy named Stamitz in the small German town of Manstein. So uh, he was instrumental in giving us this new kind of classical style, and he pioneered this idea of the symphony that later on was taken up by Haydn. And Stamitz also began to rationalize the the orchestra. So we get a balanced ensemble, and this is in keeping with the whole idea of balance and emotional balance and reserve and all this. So we have um, a balanced ensemble that involves a certain number of strings. You get four on a part in the strings. Four violins, four second violins, four violas, four cellos, a couple of string basses, and then you get in the back, you get the timpani. Um, you may get one or two trumpets sometimes. Every once in a while, you'll add a trombone or two, but not generally. And these balanced woodwinds, one bassoon, two oboes, an oboe maybe, and an English horn, a clarinet or two. The clarinet comes to the fore during this period. Mozart championed the clarinet, wrote some wonderful music for clarinet, whereas in the Baroque period, you don't hear the clarinet very much, if at all. So the clarinet is this new instrument that's added. So this classical orchestra, this balanced ensemble, is a big part of the this Viennese classical period. And there you see that's what the orchestra eventually would become uh, by the middle of the 19th century, when the orchestra grows in size. During this period, the orchestra would probably never exceed more than 35 or 40 players. But in the 19th century, you'll get 100, 120. Um, so there they are. So there you have the four movements of the symphony. Um, just to reiterate, the first movement, sonata allegro, second movement, slow, ternary, or maybe theme and variations. Third movement, minuet and trio, ternary form, or of course, scherzo and trio, which is also ternary. And then the fourth movement, fast, it's either rondo or sonata form. So those are the four movements of the symphony, and the string quartet is very similar to this. So you'll see a four movement plan for string quartet as well. So first movement, we're going to talk about the. I think this is the time when we begin to talk about the G minor symphony. You'll notice on page 115, 116, 117 of your textbook, you have the sonata cycle laid out in detail as well. So I'm just reiterating what you're going to see here and read here in this thing. They mentioned Stamitz, they mentioned Mannheim, and then Haydn, and so yes. So we're going to basically go through this four movement plan here and give you some examples. So the G minor symphony, um, this the listening guide's on page 121. This is symphony number 40 in G minor. And notice you've got a theme, you've got basically this sonata allegro plan, an exposition, theme one, uh, theme two, and in between these things you have these bridges that kind of connect the two themes. Theme one's in G minor, theme two is in B flat major, a final theme which closes the exposition. Then the exposition is repeated, and so you hear it twice, and then you get a development section. Um, and the development section ends with a big cadence on to G minor, and then you'll get theme one, a bridge, and theme two in the recapitulation, and a short coda. So that is the Mozart Symphony number 40 in G minor. So listen to it. It's all marked out in different tracks in the listening example. So track 13 is the first theme, right? And then there's a bridge, and then and when that plays out, there's this half cadence, and then you begin the second theme, which is in B flat major, a closing theme that ends the exposition on a wonderful cadence in B flat major. And then the whole thing is repeated. There's the Mozart family. Mozart's mother died in 1778, I believe. So the family there is in front. There's Nannerl, Wolfgang, and Leopold, and Mozart's mother, uh, who's memorialized there with that portrait. Then we get to the development section. This is track 15, and so you get this first theme, and the thing you'll notice about this first theme is it starts playing out and then it changes keys. So with the development section, you frequently change key, and you'll move from major to minor as well, or minor to major, either way. So you hear frequent key changes. Mozart begins to state this theme upside down. So instead of dropping the half step, it goes up, and you'll hear all those things if you listen carefully. And so this is the game that the composer plays with the listener here. What am I doing in the development section? Um, well, here's what I'm doing. So that's track 15. Then the recapitulation begins. Again, there's this huge cadence on to G minor. And so we're back in G minor here. And he states the theme 1 in G minor with a bridge. The bridge is kind of elongated here. And then theme 2 comes in the key of G minor. So no more B flat major. And yeah, that's track 17. The theme 2 is track 17. And then the coda is track 18 in your recording. So that is a short kind of section that's tacked on at the end of the movement to bring it to a more convincing conclusion. And so that is that first movement of this symphony number 40 in G minor, right? Written in 1788. He didn't know it, but he only had 3 years left to live when he wrote this when this symphony came out. But yeah, so it's just part of this enormous output that Mozart composed. So let's go on to a second movement. Now this, well, okay. So the third movement is going to be a minuet and trio in Mozart and Haydn, and you've got that listening guide on page 123. So this third movement, minuet and trio, it's in triple meter, it's ABA, and you've got this minuet theme. Bum 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 bum. So it's a marcato theme. It's a very marked out, and there's a lot of dissonance as you listen to this first section of this minuet theme. It's really interesting dissonance. It involves these appoggiaturas that are entered. You go up and you hear this clashing dissonance, and then it's resolved. That's what makes this interesting, this marcato thing. The trio, which is track 28, is much more legato, and so it's softer. So it's a real contrast to that marked out, that marcato theme of the minuet. And then the minuet is repeated, so we get this ternary form A, B, A, and that's track 29. And so that's the reason I've got the first and then the third movement is simply because these movements are both from the symphony number 40. We do have an example of a second movement, though, by Haydn. Yeah, Haydn's ability is he's kind of overshadowed a bit by Mozart, but not much. Haydn was a brilliant composer. He was born in what is now Croatia, which was part of the Habsburg so-called empire. And he went as a young guy to sing in the choir at St. Stephen's Cathedral, and it was there that he met the great Niccolo Porpora, who taught him music. He studied music under one of the finest music uh, theoreticians in Europe, and developed his abilities as a composer under Porpora, and then got this job at the Esterhazy estate, maybe 30, 35 miles away from Vienna. And the Esterhazys were the number two family in this Austro-Hungarian empire. So they are very powerful, very wealthy, and he became their main composer. And Haydn was in charge of writing music, hiring musicians, communicating with his patron in various ways, and understanding what the count wanted, and basically writing music to satisfy the needs of the Esterhazy court there at the Esterhazy uh, palace. And so he spent 40 years working for the Esterhazys and kind of retired. And by the time he retired, he was famous. Well, actually, he was world famous when he retired. Spent some time in London writing symphonies. I believe this symphony number 94 was written in London, and became very popular uh, in London. He outlived Mozart, even though he was older than Mozart by a couple of decades. He outlived Mozart. I believe he died in 1807 in Vienna. So he lived to see the chaos of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, whereas Mozart died right before that began. Um, and so a lot of his composition is a fair amount of his composition occurs during that time. So the mass setting that he wrote, a mass in times of anxiety, and it's called the Lord Nelson Mass today, but it begins with a very plaintive, Kyrie, Lord have mercy on us, in the soprano solo. And so you hear it kind of as a panic-stricken thing, because you know Napoleon was winning, and you know they didn't know what was going to happen. So you know, so yeah, yeah. So Haydn is somewhat affected by the Napoleonic conflicts, just like Beethoven. Symphonies, string quartets. He wrote some operas, lots of sacred music, mass settings, oratorios, wonderful oratorios. The Creation is one of his greatest works, and it's a wonderful piece for chorus, orchestra, soloists, and yeah, well worth hearing. So the Surprise Symphony, number 94, in G major. You have this on page 122 and 123. And this is a theme and variations. So it's a slower tempo. Instead of being allegro, it's a walking tempo andante, maybe 70 beats per minute. And you get this theme and variations. So you start out with the theme, pum, 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 pum. And there is a surprise there, which you'll hear. And then at 107, you get the first variation. At 214, you hear a variation. Instead of G minor, it plays in a minor. Instead of G major, it's in a minor key. So you have a minor variation. Then at 323, you hear an oboe playing the theme in repeated 16th notes. And then you have this really loud variation 4, where the timpani and the brass come in, and then it kind of winds down at 554, where you get a bit of a little coda. And that's the Surprise Symphony theme and variations. Charming piece. Um, The concerto is still popular. We heard with the La Primavera, the Vivaldi's solo concerto, when we talked about Baroque music. Now we're going to basically explore Mozart and what he's doing with his uh, concertos. By the time Mozart comes around, they adapt the concerto to this sonata allegro idea. So the first movement of a concerto, whether it's for the piano or for an oboe or a clarinet or a bassoon or whatever instrument, and Mozart composed concertos for all of those instruments, but uh, it doesn't matter. The first movement is going to be in this double exposition sonata form. Well, what do I mean by double exposition? Well, it's simple. The orchestra plays the themes of the exposition, and then rather than repeating the themes, the exposition, the solo instrument plays the themes. So you get the orchestra, and the orchestra ends with this big cadence at the end of the orchestral exposition. Then the solo instrument picks up the themes and plays them. So with this piano concerto in A major, you'll hear the orchestra coming in playing in this first theme. You know, and that first theme basically is is gives way to a second theme in a contrasting key. That's the theme of the first theme. Then there's a bridge. Then the orchestra comes in and plays the second theme rather softly, and it's repeated by the bassoon and the flute. And then they end on a big cadence, and the second exposition begins with the piano. So we hear this double exposition. The orchestra plays the themes, then the solo instrument, in this case the piano, comes in. So yeah, then you hear a slow movement and then a fast third movement, which may be sonata form, it may be rondo form, it may be sonata rondo form. At any rate, it's this again, the solo instrument. The other big difference here is the cadenza. At various places in the first movement, especially of one of these concertos, you will hear a cadenza. In Mozart, the cadenza is kind of improvised. Later on, they're written out. But the cadenza in this Mozart piano concerto first movement takes place at the end of the recapitulation. So this is a long piano solo, which ends with a trill, which is the signal for the orchestra to come back in. So you hear, and then the orchestra comes back in and finishes off the first movement with a coda. So this double exposition, right, form, this is on page 129. Track 20 is the first theme and the bridge. So listen to that to hear this very elegant, reserved tune, very much in keeping with these principles of the aesthetic principles of these enlightened despots for whom this music is written. Then theme 2 probably is the theme 1's an A major, theme 2's probably an E major. That I would bet on that. So here's the second theme then comes in, and the orchestra plays both these themes. So that's the first exposition. Then the second exposition begins, and that is track 22. And the piano plays what the orchestra played. It plays theme 1 with the bridge, but this time you have the solo piano, and the orchestra is accompanying the piano here. And then you get theme 2, same deal, the piano and the orchestra have this dialogue, and so the piano plays throughout theme 2, and that ends the double exposition. So none of this is repeated like it is in the symphony. So we're going to get a new theme introduced in the development section. That's interesting. It's one of the interesting features of the piano concerto, is that we get a new theme in the development section very often, whether it's Mozart or Beethoven, it's immaterial. you'll hear a new thematic idea introduced right in the strings, and then the piano, the clarinet plays it, um, and that development section also develops some of the ideas from the expositions, and then again you get a big cadence onto the key of A major for the recapitulation, where these two themes are restated again in the recapitulation, but not in a double recapitulation. The piano and the orchestra play together, and there's no modulation for theme two. It stays in the key of A major. And so it describes what's going on there in tracks 25 and 26. And then the uh, theme two ends with this tonic 6/4 chord. Okay, so in other words, it's an A major triad, but with an E in the bass. So it has this sort of cadential figure. It doesn't say. It sounds like it's almost over, but not quite over. And that is the key for the pianist to play the cadenza. So the pianist plays the cadenza and kind of rehashes the themes that were introduced in the exposition and recapitulated, but does it in a way to demonstrate the piano skill. Of course, Mozart wrote this concerto for himself, and so we have a good indication of what Mozart's piano skills were, and they were pretty, as you can imagine, pretty good. So this cadenza basically ends with this long trill, and that's the signal for the orchestra to come back in and finish up the movement. So the coda here is track 28. So and then the movement ends softly to prepare us for the slow movement of this A major piano concerto. So the A major concerto by Mozart, it follows generally the quote unquote rules or the outline that's laid down for your average everyday, double exposition sonata form. So it's a good one to basically study and listen to get a feel for that. Non-Errol, who you see there, taught Mozart, and after Mozart's death, she outlived him by decades. She championed his music, and one of the reasons that we have Mozart's music is Non-Errol, his sister, who recognized her brother's incredible musical genius and made sure, to champion it across Western Europe so that people could hear this music over and over again. And so she actually made sure Mozart's music was heard. And so she's a very important player in this drama of Wolfgang Mozart. That she's really, to a great extent, the reason we have Mozart today. There are other women virtuosi as well. Maria Theresa von Paradis and Barbara von Pleuer. So we're going to move on then to chamber music. And what we have is a good example of a string quartet by Haydn. There are all kinds of other chamber forms: a piano quartet, a piano trio, piano quintet. But really, the great invention of this is the string quartet. So Haydn's string quartet pieces were designed for often designed for state occasions. This Opus 3, number 33, Opus 33, number 3, The Bird, was designed for performance at this official state visit of the heir to the Russian throne. And so this is a big deal when somebody like that shows up at the Esterhazy Palace. So we need some wonderful music, and Haydn was more than happy to supply it. So the listening guide for The Bird is on page 136. 137. This is the final movement. And you notice it's kind of half sonata, half rondo. Uh, so what we hear with this bouncy theme sounds like a bird flitting around, and we get this idea, this bouncy bird idea. That's that idea, and so you hear that, and that's track 29, and it's repeated, and then you get a more lyric kind of B section, a little bit less dynamic level, and so that only lasts a few seconds. You move on to kind of a little development of this A section. So you hear a kind of a developmental passage, and this might be performed in a hall that looks like that. Okay, very elegant, uh, very opulent. Okay, this is the kind of place where you'd hear this music. Then, of course, this AID, the bouncing theme, returns again in track 32, and then track 33, the more flowing idea before we get the second little short development. That's track 34. And track 35 is the bouncy A theme again. And the coda for track 36. So that is the bird. So don't forget to listen to that. Mauro Giuliani was a great guitar virtuoso who was renowned for his guitar abilities across Western Europe. So this is a guy who toured playing the guitar. He was also quite a good composer. He's kind of contemporary to Beethoven, so he's in this later part of this Viennese classical era. He composed these sonatas for himself to play with flute accompaniment. So we have these sonatas written for flute and guitar, and so this is a chamber music for more than one instrument. Okay, flute and guitar chamber music, and this grand sonata number 85 is you'll see the listening guide on page 138 of your textbook. This is the scherzo and trio movement of the Grand Sonata, and it kind of basically follows this ternary idea that is part of this scherzo and trio plan. This is the third movement of a four-movement sonata. As you listen to this, you'll see that the guitar and the flute have this wonderful dialogue that goes on. Most of the time, the guitar accompanies the flute in a way, because the guitar is a kind of a perfect accompaniment instrument. But the guitar gets kind of a solo um, uh, uh, in the trio part. So there's a bit more guitar there. But it's basically just a three-part ternary form, and it's very charming scherzo and trio movement. Okay, as I said before, opera becomes very popular. It retains its popularity. Obviously, it exploded during the Baroque period, and composers in the last half of the 18th century write a lot of operas. Haydn composed operas. They're mostly serious operas, um, and but Mozart composed both Singspiels and comic operas as well as serious operas. Beethoven only got around to composing one opera, which is a kind of a Singspiel. Um, and it's done frequently. The music is glorious. The plot is stupid, but the music is great. But but he worked on the opera for 12 years. So he never got around to composing another opera because he didn't have another 12 years. So so there you have. This is the finale to Act One of Don Giovanni by Mozart in the picture. So you get an idea kind of what these Mozart operas are like when they're staged. Um, Also, of course, Haydn was famous for composing these wonderful mass settings, um, and they're large, grand affairs for orchestra, soloists, and choruses. So these are big compositions. And then the creation and the seasons. He also composed uh, an oratorio called the Seasons. So the creation is done quite frequently, and it's well worth hearing. It's a wonderful music there. But again, we get uh, three kinds of opera. Opera seria is very similar to what they were doing in the Baroque. In other words, Greco-Roman antiquity figures large in this. Gluck, of course, set Orfeo again, so as a kind of to try to bring about a revolution in opera. Um, but Mozart composed opera seria. One is called The Mercy of Titus, La Clemenza di Tito. The other is Idomeneo. These are operas based on classical antiquity, and very often they will include castrati singers. So you have those Baroque kinds of conventions present in these serious operas. Mozart's serious operas are not done as frequently. Again, the music is glorious, but they're not done as much as the comic operas. And this is where Mozart shines. The Singspiel and the comic operas are where Mozart just explodes. Um, uh, the opera buffa uh, is a comic opera form, and it's kind of a newcomer that gets popular, becomes popular during this period. And and again, the plots are not limited to these Greco-Roman classical antiquity things. So you don't get Roman history. You get plots that are in the here and now, and plot situations that are in the here and now. So, and of course, the here and now means the 1780s, okay, but still, um, and the characters come to life in a way that characters in the serious operas don't. So they are characters that are dealing with dilemmas that influence us to this very day. Um, and so it's really important to hear these things because Mozart gets into the realities of living daily. And so there's the plot situations and the characters are as real today as they were in the 1780s when Mozart was composing these pieces. Uh, so it's Mozart was a not just a great composer, he was a great theater guy as well, and he knew how to portray these characters, and he does it so beautifully. Um, so um, we're going to talk about the Marriage of Figaro, and this is an opera buffa uh, that has a kind of a complicated life. It begins its life as a play written by a French playwright named Beaumarchais. And Beaumarchais basically drew on Commedia dell'arte for his characters. Commedia dell'arte was a comic form of play that was presented by traveling uh, actors and playwrights all across Europe, especially in Italy. And they drew on these stock characters, Harlequin, um, Columbina, uh, on and on. And you can see Columbina and Harlequin in this Marriage of Figaro. But there's also a political twist in this play. It challenges the respectability and the the power of the aristocrat elites, because the play is a bedroom farce. Um, Susanna and Figaro are going to get married, but they are servants in the palace of the count. And the count wants to basically uh, renew this thing, this ancient law in France called the droit du seigneur. Uh, the droit du seigneur dates back to pagan Frank times, um, pre-Christian Frankish tribal customs, and the custom is this: the lord, the head of the clan, the head of the tribe, reserves the right of deflowering the virgins on their wedding night. So you get married, but you don't sleep with the groom, you sleep with the Lord. And this was a custom that was respected and welcome uh, during pagan times. It's still on the books, though, in the 18th century. So the lord of the manor, be a count or a duke or a king, if his servants get married, he has every right to sleep with the servant girl on their wedding night. So obviously, Susanna doesn't want the count to sleep with her. And Figaro is really basically right there with her, as you can imagine. So they have to figure out, how do we keep the count out of the wedding bed on our wedding night? That's exactly what they're doing. And the plot of the Marriage of Figaro is basically the way that these women plot. Well, the count, of course, is married, and guess what? His wife isn't keen on the idea of him sleeping with Susanna on her wedding night either. What do you know? And so we have these allies, Susanna, Figaro, uh, the Countess, and they are basically trying to keep the Count from bedding Susanna on her wedding night or any other time for that matter. So that's the plot. Um, Mozart's Mozart basically enlisted the help of an Italian, a Viennese, or a Venetian poet, a guy who's an interesting character in his own right. And Da Ponte, Lorenzo da Ponte, adapted this Beaumarchais play to an opera libretto. And he wrote this libretto. It's a translation of the Beaumarchais from French to Italian. And Mozart set it to music. And it's a very involved plot. It's very detailed and very convoluted, as you can imagine. But it all ends happily when the count decides, okay, I won't sleep with Susanna, and 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 that's so it ends happily for Susanna and Figaro and the Countess. So it's a wonderful, wonderful opera. It's just one of the greatest things ever written, and it's done all the time. So don't miss a performance. So we're talking about the Marriage of Figaro, and we're kind of going to listen to a couple of excerpts from the Marriage of Figaro. Both of these are from the first act of the Marriage of Figaro. Um, the the plot is pretty simple. The Count is lusting after one of his servants, Susanna. Susanna is supposed to marry Figaro, and the Count has a legal right to share the wedding bed with Susanna on the night of her marriage. And so the plot centers around how to keep the Count out of Susanna's bedchamber. It's pretty simple. Um, but since he's the Count and they're servants, it's a little more difficult than than it would be today, maybe. Um, so one of the most charming characters in the entire opera is Cherubino. Cherubino is the Count's page, and Cherubino is about 13 to 15 years old. His voice hasn't quite managed to change yet, so the part is played by a soprano. So when you hear a soprano sing this part of a young boy, what you're hearing is this kid whose voice hasn't changed, but he's starting to go through adolescence. And so he begins to describe to Susanna, he confides in Susanna about his confusion. He's terribly confused. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what's going on. I have all these feelings, and every woman I see causes me to sigh, and it goes on and on like that. And so, and he describes his confusion in this aria, "Non so più cosa son." I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm about. And it's the translation of this thing is on page 145 of the textbook. and the and so Cherubino is confused. He's frantic. He's you know, and he sways from one emotion to the next, and the music reflects that. It's a music that sounds confused and frantic. It's a rather fast aria, and it's kind of a unique form. It's just ABA C coda. And so it's kind of rondo-like, but not really. And so Mozart kind of invented his own little form for this thing, and so Cherubino is talking about love when he's awake, dreaming about love when he's asleep. He can't stop thinking about love. And he goes on and on like this. So he's going through adolescence, and I think those of us who have gone through it before will kind of can relate to this. Oh yeah, I remember those days. Thank God they're over. But for Cherubino, it's not over. And so listen to this aria. It's mainly homophonic, duple meter, and it's pretty fast. Non so più cosa son, cosa faccio, um, it's a great piece. Only lasts about 3 minutes. And so, unfortunately, Cherubino sings this aria, and things get really prickly when Cherubino finishes the aria. Because when Cherubino finishes the aria, the count comes into Susanna's bedroom. And Cherubino has to hide behind this chair and listen in while the count attempts to seduce Cherubino. And, and during this scene, the count walks behind the chair, and Cherubino has to hurry up and hide in the chair, and Susanna covers him with a blanket. And then the count removes the blanket and discovers in the chair Cherubino, and he can't believe it. And uh, his attitude is, "Why are you playing around with a boy? I'm a man. Don't you want me instead?" That's and so so Cherubino is caught red-handed in Susanna's bedroom by the count, and even worse, right? Don Basilio comes in, and Basilio is the gossip monger at court, and uh, and so now the news is going to get out about this. This is juicy gossip right here. So it's an embarrassing situation for everyone concerned. And the count says, "Okay, I'm done with you, Mr. Cherubino. I'm going to give you a commission, and you're going to go into the army um, and fight in the never-ending wars that were always going on in the 18th century." And so that's the end of that. Well, Figaro shows up after this, after the count leaves, and Susanna tells him that Cherubino is now a captain in the army, and he's going to command troops in the war. And so Figaro sings this wonderful aria, "Non più avrai," which is pretty humorous. He kind of makes light of Cherubino's, life as a page in the Count's court, and says, "Well, you're not going to have any of these fine clothes anymore. Instead, you're going to be, slogging through the mud." And listening to the cannons going off and the bullets whizzing past your ear. So, and of course, this translation of this is on pages 146 and 147. This is a great example of a rondo form. And this wonderful tune keeps coming back as the sort of the refrain of this rondo. Non potrai farfallone amoroso, notte giorno d'intorno girando, delle belle turbando il riposo, narcisetto adoncino d'amor. And so there you have that little tune. And then you have these interludes, right? The B tune comes in, and then the repeat of A, and so you hear that. Then there's this wonderful coda where Figaro sings "Cherubino alla vittoria, alla gloria militar," right? Uh, so yeah, Carabino on to victory. And then there's a wonderful coda that involves this great sort of military march as Cherubino marches off to war, and the first act ends. It's a great scene. So comic opera is really where Mozart shines, especially in his collaboration with Lorenzo da Ponte. Da Ponte left Vienna after collaborating with Mozart on these three operas, uh, spent some time in London, and then crossed the Atlantic and ended up in New York City, where he taught Italian at King's College. It was later to become Columbia University. So and he wrote his memoirs. So the memoirs make for interesting reading because he describes these productions of Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, etc. In theirs. So he lived to the ripe old age of 90 some years old, and so he was quite an interesting figure. Uh, Mozart also composed these Singspiels. A Singspiel is like a Broadway play. It's sung arias and ensembles with spoken dialogue instead of recitative, and they're in German. Uh, the operas are in Italian. The comic opera and the serious opera are in Italian, but the Singspiels are sung in German. And of course, the Magic Flute, which is a perennial favorite, is a Singspiel, but it's also performed all the time, and it's in German. So there you see a scene from the Magic Flute. That's actually the first scene of the opera. And the Requiem in D minor, Mozart finished the Magic Flute just before he died. He was also working on this Requiem that was commissioned by a guy who wanted to remain anonymous. We kind of know who he was today, and the reason he wanted to be unknown is because he wanted to pass the work off as his own. Mozart died before he could finish it, and um, it was finished by his colleagues, and so yeah, and it's really a great piece. His colleagues did a wonderful job finishing this requiem. Well, Beethoven. Um, Beethoven is a guy who begins to change the rules, and and of course he's living in an era where the rules are changing. So um, Beethoven is the last in this three generation pattern. Haydn is the first generation, then Mozart comes along, and Beethoven, he was born in 1770 in the city of Bonn in Germany, and he moved to Vienna, where he became quite renowned as a pianist and composer. Um, so by the year 1800, Beethoven is enjoying a fair amount of uh, what's the word a fame as a composer and pianist. Um, by about 1802 or 1803, he begins to notice that he can't hear as well, and by 1807, he's mostly deaf. And by 1810, he was completely, profoundly deaf. He couldn't hear anything. Um, so Beethoven's deafness really plays a role in his compositional process. As you can imagine, he's not really happy about going deaf. This is just about the worst thing that can happen to a musician, especially one as brilliant as Beethoven. He so uh, he starts out writing pretty much in the style of Mozart, um, and so his early symphonies sound like Mozart, but beginning with the Third Symphony, he begins to kind of depart and begins to display a kind of creative brilliance, um, and um, begins to kind of break out from some of the compositional conventions that were there in with Mozart and Haydn. And for instance, in the Eroica Symphony, right, the tune is da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee, and that sudden modulation in that tune is something you would never have heard before. So when he goes da dee da dee da dee, that that note doesn't belong in that scale in the Eroica Symphony, the Third Symphony. It's out of character. It's a sudden twist and change of key right there. And so he's telling you something right there. He said, I'm going to be doing a lot of this kind of thing, and and he does. There's no doubt about it. So Beethoven was his personality was very different from that of both Mozart and Haydn. He was uh, very independent-minded. Um, he was quixotic. Um, he his emotions ran to extremes. And so there are those who say that he may have been bipolar. We don't know for sure, but it's hard to say. But it is he does exhibit those sorts of tendencies, and his compositional process was very different. Um, Haydn wrote 100 and some odd symphonies. He would churn those things out like crazy. And Mozart wrote 50 or some in his 36 years. And so they didn't think anything about writing a lot of music fast. Mozart edited everything in his head, and so his manuscripts look like finished copies. Um, I mean, it's beautiful, neat, tidy, um, and there aren't a lot of problems in figuring out what Mozart was writing. Beethoven's process, he edited everything right on the page. He used a razor blade to scratch notes and names off the page of the score. He crossed things out, and it's full of ink blots. I mean, it's a mess. Yeah, Beethoven's process is different. He uh, he lived, 20 years longer than Mozart, but he only composed 9 symphonies. So think about that. Mozart composed 50 odd in 36 years. Beethoven, who lived to be, 57, 56 years old, um, only composed 9. His process was very different. Um, he, the coda for the first movement of Symphony Number 5, there are 5 versions of that. He struggled with that, and he worked and worked on that coda until he got it right, whatever that means. He only composed 1 opera, and that's simply because it took him 12 years to write the opera. Music is glorious. Plots is horrible. The music in Fidelio, though, is wonderful. It's the result of 12 years of struggle and labor. So Beethoven is always, starting over, re-editing, redoing, and so his process is very different. Um, so he still managed to compose a lot of wonderful music. Symphonies, concertos, piano sonatas, string quartets. There's a mass setting. There's a couple of mass settings, an oratorio, and uh, and that opera, the Fidelio. Um, there's a fair amount of vocal music too, but most of his music is instrumental. It's he didn't really do a lot with the vocal realm. Of course, the Ninth Symphony has the last movement of the Ninth Symphony is a choral movement, which features chorists, soloists, and orchestra. So the first time anybody thought of doing that with in a symphony. So there you have that. Um, but Beethoven's music is a reflection of his personality. There's a lot of passion in his music. There's a lot of the emotional content is very quixotic. It changes rapidly, and so that personality is really reflected. And many times he's basically dealing with issues that he's going through in the music. And we certainly see an example of that in the Fifth Symphony. Um, so Beethoven's personality is different. His composition process is different. So yeah, and of course, after he went deaf, he became virtually a hermit. There was no way to communicate with anybody except, in writing, and so he literally locked himself in his room and composed quite a bit of things. But you know, yeah. So Beethoven is a fascinating character to this day. Beethoven had a complicated relationship with the politics of his era. So not only is he going deaf, but he's dealing with the chaos created by the French Revolution. Um, Beethoven lived in Vienna. The Habsburgs were constantly at war with the Napoleon, and and there were periods of peace, and then they would try again to defeat Napoleon. The Habsburgs could never defeat him on the battlefield, and so there's this constant frustration. And so not only is he dealing with impending deafness, he's dealing with this character Napoleon. In fact, he used the Bonapartes to wrangle a pension out of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were the ruling family in Austria, and so Joseph Bonaparte basically wanted to hire Beethoven as his court composer and be Beethoven's patron. And so Beethoven became a free agent, I guess you'd say. It's a sports metaphor. He took the offer and shopped it around the Habsburg royalty in Austria, and one of them upped the offer and said, "Okay, here's a salary for life." And so Beethoven freed himself from this patronage system simply by playing off the Bonapartes against the Habsburgs. So he remained in Vienna and literally could do anything he wanted to. But his passion was composing and music, and so that's what he did. And but he could write any kind of music he wanted. He was not limited to the next event, the next party, the next state visit, the way that Haydn was. Uh, and so, he composed freely and kind of did what he wanted to. And at first, Beethoven kind of supported Napoleon. He thought Napoleon would bring representative democracy because, the French Revolution, what they were trying to do is become like the American Revolution. Um, so he thought that Napoleon was a kind of a George Washington type who would bring representative democracy to Europe and get rid of the monarchs and the dukes and the earls and all of that, and just basically create constitutions for all these countries and bring representative democracy to Europe. And in fact, he was writing a symphony in honor of Napoleon. It's called the Heroic Symphony. I mentioned it before. It's his Symphony Number 3, written in 1802, 1803. And as Beethoven is working on this symphony, he's slaving away writing this thing, he got news that Napoleon was planning a little ceremony in Paris. Uh, the ceremony involved kidnapping the Pope, selling a bunch of land to the United States. They called it the Louisiana Purchase because it was an elaborate ceremony, and he needed money. So he sold this land to the United States to pay for this ceremony, kidnapped the Pope, and brought him from Rome to Paris, and snatched the crown out of the Pope's hands and put it on his own head and crowned himself emperor of Europe. Um, so to Beethoven, this meant that Napoleon wasn't interested in democracy. He was just another tyrant. And so he included a march for a dead hero, a dirge in the symphony. So um, there's this complicated relationship there. And that relationship continues throughout, Beethoven's most of his life. Finally, Napoleon, of course, was defeated at Waterloo and exiled to a rock off the coast of Africa in 1815. But up until then, there's this complicated kind of interesting relationship that goes on. Um, so in 1807, uh, not only is Beethoven going deaf, but also Napoleon's army is outside of Vienna, bombarding the city. I mean, Napoleon was laying siege to the city, so it wasn't a pleasant time to be around. So Beethoven's, you know, Beethoven, to say the least, is not a happy camper here. And so he's basically writing this symphony to get himself out of a funk. And this is a process that takes him a long time. So the symphony is just like a Mozart or Haydn symphony. It's a 4-movement symphony. And the first movement is going to be Sonata Allegro. Second movement is Andante, theme and variations. Third movement, Scherzo and Trio. And fourth movement, Sonata Allegro. So it pretty much follows that sort of sonata cycle plan that Mozart and Haydn were using. But that's worth those are the similarities, really. But the differences are striking. Um, so, for one thing, the entire symphony is based on this 4-note idea. Ba, 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 ba. And the symphony begins, the first theme of that first movement of the symphony is this 4-note idea. Beethoven called it fate knocking at the door. It's angry, it's defiant, uh, and well, how would you feel if you were going deaf in the middle of a war? I mean, that's kind of what's going on here. And it's in C minor. Now, C minor is an interesting choice of key especially for the strings. It's a very dull key for the strings because there aren't, especially for the violin, there aren't that many open strings. The open strings resonate and sound brighter on these stringed instruments. But here, Beethoven chooses a key that doesn't have that many open strings. So it sounds dull. And you may not know that that's why, but you'll notice that it sounds dull. It sounds sort of a little bit off. And that's what Beethoven wants because the world is a little bit off. And so he's raging at fate, and he doesn't like the situation he's in. So the first theme is this 4-note idea. The second theme is in C major, though. So it modulates to C major, which is a very bright key. And he's kind of giving us kind of a foretaste of things to come. Da dee da dee da dee da da. And it's not as angry. It's more of a flowing kind of legato theme. So we have that. And you'll notice in your listening guide on page 153, you've got that first theme, and then the next track is the second theme and the repetition of the exposition. So you'll hear that. You'll hear the exposition twice with those two ideas. Once he's done with that, he develops that 4-note idea. And right, this is on page 153 of your text. So he develops that whole 4-note idea, reducing it to 2 notes and then to 1 note before he moves back. And again, it ends in this big cadence onto C minor, and we recapitulate the 2 themes here. So listen to that first movement, and you'll notice, though, that on page 154, the coda lasts for about a minute and a half, minute and 45 seconds. So this is a rather long coda. It just keeps going. And he introduces a new theme in the coda. Um, but it's a four note theme. Body ba dum bum bum 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 ba dum. So it's that still a four note idea. It's just a variation of it as a new theme in this coda. So he's still not a happy camper, um, and he shows because that coda is basically kind of continues that defiant, angry mood before it ends. So theme one, da 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 da, pa 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 pa, da 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 da, and then there's a bridge um, that takes us out of C minor into C major for the second theme. Theme two, much more legato, much less sort of defiant and angry. And then we go back to the four note idea to close out the exposition and then repeat the exposition. And then the four note theme in the development is reduced to two notes, then to one note. So we fragment the theme, I guess you would say. And then it ends on a big cadence back onto the key of C minor for the recapitulation. And so we hear the first theme again, da 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 da, ba, 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 C minor. Theme two, again, da dee da dee da dee. It's still in C major. It doesn't stay in C minor. A lot of times, composers will stay in the original key in the recapitulation, but here it's in C major. And then this long, elongated coda, which Beethoven was famous for, extending these codas in these movements. And so we hear very much a long kind of coda that where he introduces this new theme. Now, the second movement is the theme and variations. And in your textbook, it's on page 154, 155. It says that there are two themes, which is fine. I prefer to think about it as a theme with a refrain. So the first theme of the theme and variations is da dee dee ba dee dee ba dee ba dum ba dee da da ba dum ba dum ba da bum bum ba dee bum 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 ba dee dum. So that's the theme. But there's this refrain and the refrain is really a four note idea. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that refrain is based on that four note idea with a little pickup. Bum, ba, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you hear that, and it really comes out when the brass turns it into a fanfare. You notice timbre wise that Beethoven's orchestra is much larger than the orchestra employed by Mozart or Haydn. He adds trombones and he increases the number of stringed instruments and woodwinds. So this is his resources are larger, and so he employs a much larger orchestra. And you hear the trombones in the fourth movement. The trombones don't have anything to do until we get to the last movement, and then they really shine. So he adds those instruments as time goes on. So there are these different variations. So the theme he introduces with the refrain. So with the theme and then the refrain, then we get these variations. There's there are two variations that we can hear. Then there's this middle section where he moves away from this whole theme and variations thing, and it becomes freely composed. And it just kind of plays around with the, some things that are related to the theme, but and you keep hearing the refrain after each of these variations and in this middle section. Finally, you get to a third variation and label variation 3A, which is played really loud tutti, right? The whole orchestra comes in, and so yeah, and then he winds down with a coda at the end of this theme and variations. So it's a very interesting theme and variations. It's about a 10-minute long movement, so it's kind of taxes your listening endurance, but it's worth it. The more you hear it, the better you like it. Believe it, believe me, I hear it 2 or 3 times every semester. So the third movement, scherzo and trio. So this is ABA, and right there is a scherzo theme. Bom ba da dee ba dee ba dee, bom ba dum bom ba da dee, ba da da dee ba dee ba dee ba ba. And then after he introduces that scherzo theme, there is this 4-note refrain. Ta 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 ta, ba 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 ba. You hear it in the French horns. Ba 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 ba, be da da da, be 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 be. And so and then he goes back to the scherzo theme with the repeat of um, uh, that 4-note idea. Then the trio sounds like he's trying to get a fugue started, but it never does get off the ground. So the joke is really in the trio, not in the scherzo, as I'm thinking. So but this fugue never gets started. It's always stops, and finally the cellos try to start it and they stutter but it never gets off the ground. And so finally it all winds down and Beethoven returns to this scherzo theme with that refrain. At the end of that return of the scherzo, we have this, he we have this transitional section, um, and you hear the 4-note theme in the timpani very softly, and it starts out softly and it gradually builds until finally strings and woodwinds get to a forte dynamic, and the it's supposed to be attached directly to the fourth movement. Of course, we don't get that here because the fourth movement is a separate track. But when you listen to the symphony performed, you'll hear it transition directly into that fourth movement, which is in the key of C major. So as I said before, scherzo and trio, ternary form, transition to the fourth movement at the end. So the fourth movement is in the key of C major, and it begins with this wonderful C major arpeggio, just C E G, dum bum 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 bum, and so it's just a wonderful uh, feeling of release here. You've been in this defiant, angry mood. You've gone through these stages, where you've moved kind of past it and you're getting to it, and all of a sudden the sun comes out. It's been dark for a long time. The sun comes out here with this because remember C major is very bright key. There are all these open strings for these stringed instruments. And so this is, you hear that brilliance and that resonance that you don't get with the C minor sections of this piece. So you get that, and it's a triumphant theme. I've conquered this, at least for the time being, conquered these feelings of anger, defiance, depression, sadness, loneliness. All of those things are in the past, and now I'm out of it. Um, so you know, Beethoven's trying to cheer himself up, and that's really what he's doing. And we hear that with that theme. Uh, then there's a transition. Uh, uh, and so we get that wonderful transition to the second theme, and it has this soaring quality. You know, you feel like you're being lifted out of your chair, out of your seat, and moving upwards. And then we hear the four note theme come back. Pum 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 pum. And so we get these wonderful four note ideas, and they accompany each other, and they occur at different pitch levels in the orchestra. Different instruments introduce them. The trombones come in, and for the first time you hear the richness of that trombone timbre and the brilliance of that, and so you get that whole thing, and yeah, and so there's a development and a recapitulation, and the whole thing ends in this glorious coda with in C major. So listen to that glorious first theme, and remember that this occurs right after the scherzo is over. It doesn't. You don't have to wait for it. People don't stop. The orchestra keeps playing, and so this thing emerges out of this haze, if you will, and we get this wonderful C major theme. Dum bum 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 bum. Okay, so that is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Also, now we're going to listen to Beethoven's Piano Sonata in C sharp minor. This is better known as the Moonlight Sonata. This was written a long time before he composed the C minor symphony. Um, he composed this in 1798-99. Um, and it's a kind of unique piano sonata. Usually a sonata starts with a fast movement, which is in sonata form, then a slow movement, which is sometimes just ternary form, then a fast movement, which can be rondo or sonata form. So that's your sonata plan for your average everyday piano sonata by Mozart, Haydn, and even Beethoven. But here, the first movement is slow, and it's this fantasia-like form. Uh, so you have this accompanying arpeggiated chords, and then the theme above that is just da, da, dee, bum, ba, doo, bum, ba, da, dee, da, dee, da, dee. So it's a lot of repeated notes. There's not much to that little tune, and the accompaniment pattern in the left hand is kind of what keeps it going. So it's the piano doesn't sustain all that well, but you keep hearing that note going on because of that accompaniment pattern in the left hand. It is, you notice this is homophonic texture. Okay, don't give the idea that just because it's solo piano that it's monophonic. It's not, because those are chords that are being played in the piano. They're just played one chord at a time. They're arpeggiated, and so you get this triplet arpeggiation of these chords in the left hand, and over that you have that wonderful tune in the right hand. So yeah, so this is kind of different, but that's Beethoven for you. He was a kind of a different composer, and he introduces some innovations and again, he makes personal statements that are somewhat autobiographical, even though it's in the context of a symphony, which is kind of absolute music. Beethoven doesn't have the emotional distance that Mozart and Haydn had. he is he is telling you the story of his life, and this is it, guys. This is how I'm feeling right now. And so you hear this, you get this, you're on this intimate level with this guy, and he's sharing this with us. And that's kind of new. That's not something that people were doing under that old patronage system, because after all, the patrons didn't care what they felt like. But Beethoven is giving us a new personal, and boy, composers in the 19th century are going to take that ball and run with it. It's going to be right. When you get to Berlioz, this is my life, guys. It sucks, but here it is. That's that's Berlioz. uh, so anyway, I hope you've enjoyed uh, this video. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.